Yes, hello. It's Jason Louv. Welcome back to the Ultraculture podcast. Got a super exciting episode for you today. This is a pretty heady one. I'm talking to Dr. Ted Achacoso. Yes, I'm doing interviews again. I know, it's a miracle. Dr. Ted is a super fascinating and complex guy. I'm not quite sure where to begin in introducing him. I'll just read what his students said. One of his students reached out to me to connect us, which I'm super glad about because we had a great conversation. And here's what his student said. I believe my mentor, Dr. Ted Achacoso, would be a great guest on your podcast. He's a polymath and has one of the highest IQs ever measured, somewhere in the range of 186 to 210, which is a 1 in a billion rarity. And I thought I was smart. Okay. He's had pioneering contributions to neuroscience and AI and wireless communication technology. He's one of the world's leading anti-aging and health optimization physicians, and he's an advanced understatement, his student says. It is an understatement that he is advanced meditator and shaman, particularly in the traditions of Tibetan Bon Po shamanism and Dzogchen, two spiritual traditions I have an immense fascination with. For those who don't know, Bon or Bon Po or Bon Pa sometimes is the indigenous shamanism of Tibet pre-Buddhism, and it's super out there. Also Dzogchen, which is kind of the highest reaches of Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, the non-dual tradition within Vajrayana. Super fascinating stuff. His student says Dr. Ted also happens to be a magic aficionado. And when I asked him if I could pitch him for your podcast, his response was, I love Jason's magic. Okay, sure. So, yeah, I had never heard of Dr. Ted, but now I'm glad I have because I had a great conversation with him. He's been on a ton of other podcasts. He's been on Bulletproof Radio with Dave Asprey. He's been on Ben Greenfield's fitness podcast, a ton of other stuff. He linked me tons of his publications and studies and work that he's done, and inventions, patents that he's created. Here's his official bio, okay? And he also introduces himself, so but here's his official bio. Dr. Ted Achacoso earned his college degree in biology at the age of 18 and his Doctor of Medicine degree at the age of 22. At 25, he was a fellow of interventional neuroradiology, a research professor of pharmacology and toxicology, and a clinical professor of neurology in Manila. That's in the Philippines. At 28, he became a professor of medical informatics, informatics and of interventional neuroradiology in Washington, D.C., where he also performed artificial intelligence research biased towards connectionist systems. At 30, he began science and technology consulting for socially responsible investment funds. At 35, he founded and ran a group collaboration software company and created the first wireless groupware. At 40, he traded currencies using artificial intelligence, predictive technologies, and techniques for a private fund. At 45, he retrained in interventional endocrinology, anti-aging medicine, and in nutritional medicine in Paris, as you do, and became double board certified in both specialties. Dr. Ted wrote the first ever connectome of C. elegans in a book, is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, holds U.S. patents and software algorithms, provides TV and podcast interviews, and delivers lectures. He currently has a tri-continental practice in health optimization medicine, a clinical framework that he pioneered to include health management in a disease management practice. He also formulated the blue cannatine nootropic troche, a product in the Troscriptions line of Smarter Not Harder Incorporated. Well, okay. So one thing I have noticed with super smart people is it is almost impossible to categorize them, and because they are fascinated by everything. And that is something that I've always been attracted to. It's certainly how I am. There's just a sense of being fascinated with the entire world and all of its intricate systems. That's certainly how John Dee was. You know, you can pick that up from my John Dee book. And that's, it's also a certain hallmark of the Hermetic tradition, although I'm not saying that Dr. Ted is a Hermeticist, although he's much more interested in Buddhism. But, it's a hallmark of the Hermetic tradition of just the study of everything. And I think that there really is a common trait, particularly with very, very intelligent people, that they're interested in what consciousness itself is for obvious reasons. And that often leads them to, for instance, meditation and sometimes even more out there techniques. So, which is all a long way of saying that I found Dr. Ted absolutely fascinating. You will too. We talked a lot about basically everything that I just touched on. We talked about artificial intelligence. We talked about networks. We talked about financial markets. We talked about just about everything. But we also talked quite a bit about meditation and shamanism, and he has some very unique takes and very well articulated thoughts on how meditation actually functions within the brain. Also psychedelics. He talked quite a lot about psychedelics. So there's a lot to chew on here. I think you'll really, really enjoy the interview, and just flow with it because it goes all over the place and it's great. Okay, so on that note, have you been to office hours recently? Office hours at magic.me, which is magick.me, my school for meditation, magic, and mysticism, has been in full swing. We've been doing it every 2 weeks. The last one was almost 5 hours long. Office hours is really the heart and soul of magic.me, where, of course, you can take courses in just about everything as it pertains to consciousness, magic, and the occult. That includes chaos magic, hermeticism, astral projection, tarot, you name it. It's all there, and particularly my flagship courses, Adept Initiative and Alchemy of Chaos, which are designed to take you from 0 to 60 into feeling that you are a victim of reality to you are at cause for everything in your reality very, very quickly. I've had nothing but awesome reviews for those courses, and I'm very, very proud of them. So we're obviously developing magic.me all the time, but office hours, which I sometimes call magic without tears, office hours is really the heart and soul of it. So like I said, we do it every 2 weeks, and anyone who's a paid subscriber can come and pose a question, and often I will do magic with people right there, using certain techniques to create personal breakthroughs, or we'll just talk about the nitty gritty of practice questions as it relates to magic, or where people are at in their lives, or really, it's a phenomenal experience. It's a great community. Everyone who's come to office hours has been immensely positive, genuine, curious, sincere in their practice. For my money, it is the best magic community anywhere in the world right now, and really great in a way that, we used to have in person. There's still in-person magic stuff, but obviously we live in the post-COVID world and things like that. But it truly is a space where that sincere connection between students can exist and move everyone up to a higher level together as a group. And that's just an essential part of the magic experience. You can't just get it from books. You do have to practice. But in addition to practicing, it is important and helpful at a certain point to compare notes with other people. And office hours is the best way to do that, I think. Just it's a supportive, nurturing, safe, and mutually beneficial environment. So check it out. If you're a subscriber to magic.me, you can join in at any time, and you can also watch all of the previous, we now have something like 3-4 years of archive sessions. So it's all there for you. Tremendous. The best, the very best. Okay. So on that note, please enjoy the interview and check us out at magic.me, magick.me. All right, with no further ado, here is Dr. Ted.
Oh my God, there's the $1 million voice right there.
You're too kind. All flattery accepted. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Jason. No, it's true. Didn't you see the study that said that voices like yours tend to be more elected as leaders and tend to be respected as authorities on stuff? Hey, that contributes.
I would like to see that study.
And they're now training programs for women to actually lower their voices because they climb higher in the corporate ladder.
That I have heard. The vocal fry thing, right? That I have heard.
No, this one is a lower voice. And when I heard your voice for the first time, and I said, "Ooh, Jason for president of the United States."
I accept, thankfully. I'm not immune to flattery. well, I should do the same with you. I've read you, your background is incredible, right? And we share so many interests in common. I mean, from AI to Dzogchen, and those two right there, that's like 8 podcasts. So
No, thank you. I'm perfectly happy to be quiet, Jason. I'm old now. I've seen the development of all of this stuff through the years, and it's Shaker who says, no, you shouldn't, go. And my experience has been for the past 5 years. It's like the book that I wrote in 1992, which is like increasing in reference. And I said, "What's going on?" And I called one of the researchers. And
I saw that. There was I saw even in what you sent me. You said that your work has been cited like 2,000 times.
It's like I had to ask them what's going on. I said, "Oh, didn't you know you created the world's first complete connectome for an organism?" I said, "I did." Well, I had a different name for it. It was the circuitry database for neural networks.
Why don't we? Why don't we start? You just want to? I know you said you wanted to listen, but I think let's not for now. I'm gonna listen.
Okay.
Why don't we just start off? You want to just talk about your background and tell the audience about the many things that you've done and how where you're at now and introduce yourself, please, to the audience.
Alrighty. Let's get to the boring introduction, which I can finish in like 2 minutes. I was a college graduate at the age of 18, and then I was a doctor of medicine at the age of 22. At 25, I was a member of the faculty of pharmacology and toxicology, so I know my poisons. And I was also faculty of neurology. And of course, of interventional neuroradiology, which I used to poke brains for a living. If you've ever heard of doctors who would insert tubes to vascular tumors in the brain to sclerose them or to stop them from growing, that would have been me. And I used to work with neonates. And the first thing that parents usually told me is, if anything happens to my child, I'll sue you. So that was a kind of... Yeah. And then at 28, I became a member of faculty of medical informatics at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., the medical school there. And I was trained by the guy who started it all, medical informatics globally. And my research there was in artificial intelligence. And there at the age of 30, I wrote my first book, which is the neural circuitry of the workhorse or workworm of research C. elegans, where I actually wrote and put into a spreadsheet all of the connections of the nervous system of the worm. And I had a very, very strange a premise for doing that. And I said, essentially, if I am able to take away the network that feeds and the network that mates and the network that moves, will I find a network that says, "No, I'm going to feed, I'm going to mate, I'm going to move," right? And that's the sort of the philosophy behind that research. And inadvertently, that's where I found out that I wrote the first complete connectome for an organism. And I was 35. I started a groupware company, filed a few patents, and much of them is being used by Facebook and Microsoft right now. Essentially, it was on distributed computing, which we are using extensively right now. The cloud-based computing that we're using now was essentially based on what's called a tuple space technology. And initially, I was working on it in order to further robotics. For example, telerobotics, where you are actually doing a surgery, and I'm in Washington D.C. and you're in California, and the internet stops, so what's
I never considered that. Or hopefully there's a backup power generator also.
Right. Oh no, what are you going to do? And that's the mechanism for that, right?
You hit your data cap on your phone.
And where it found its use is actually when you're withdrawing from an ATM, right? And you already put everything else, and then everything stops. It should be able to remember where you are. And that's a temporary storage in the cloud and so on. But it was in a small space. Right now, it's like huge stuff like this.
This is always one of my great worries about, as things get more and more privatized. It's like privatized healthcare. It's like you'll be halfway through a surgery and it logs you out, and you've got to solve a CAPTCHA to get back in. Like halfway through neurosurgery, or it's like, you need to renew your Amazon Prime brain subscription.
It's like put in your next coin, right? Put in your next Bitcoin to complete the surgery.
Exactly.
And then I was 30 years old. I was already lecturing, Jason, on the dangers of being extensively connected in internet. And I used to say that, if I farted in Washington, D.C., no one should be able to hear about it in California unless,
you mean social connection.
Yeah.
So what are the dangers of that, do you think?
Because it destabilizes the information. There's too much noise in the network. Remember, I started with the internet when if I post a question about the Navier-Stokes equation and how the worm would move, 6 Nobel laureates would respond to me the next day. Right? That's the kind of internet that I knew at the time.
Yeah, the way it was supposed to be.
Yeah. So when I started this company at 35, I was already looking at parallel computing and so on. But this was groupware, and the product of that was the first commercially available wireless groupware. Was produced, and then at 40, I got tired of the whole scene, and I said I wanted not to socialize for a while. I have these bouts of just wanting to be by myself, so I basically just bought myself 6 screens and some powerful computers, and I started trading currencies for an investment fund.
I'm curious what your experience with that was like, because I know a lot of really, really smart. You're obviously, phenomenally off the bell curve smart, but I know a lot of very, very smart people get into trading, often coming from technical backgrounds or computer backgrounds or mathematical backgrounds, and sometimes they're frustrated. Sometimes they're very successul, and sometimes they realize it's not as the system can't be hacked in the way that they thought, perhaps.
Okay, Jason, I have to give a little background here. When I was 30 also, I became a senior science and technology advisor to a really multi-million-dollar fund. Actually, it was a $1.6 billion fund.
Wow.
And so that basically placed me on one side of the table, right, where I was approving, companies where we would invest in. And when I was running my company, I was on the other side of the table, right? And I was the one asking for money. In fact, when I came back after 2 months on the road, and I brought in like $10 million, the Washington Technical magazine basically asked me, says, how does it feel to bring home the bacon? And I said, well, I feel like a geisha who's opened her kimono one too many times.
Oh no! No.
and,
Oh, no.
and it's like the next day, it's like all of these newspapers came, and then towards the end of that experience, I said, "There's really one part of this whole ecosystem that I know nothing about, which is money. How is it created? What's the value in it, etc." So I started diving into it. The old adage that if you're Michael Jordan, never go golfing. Well, I basically did not follow that.
Many times I should have listened to
that. and I basically, to answer your question now is, see, I've always been very, very my perspective has always been very evolutionary. So my models that work there using artificial intelligence models are evolutionary models. And I was telling people who actually cared, right, to not to bet on one or two models, but use different neural network models, predictive models like flocking, flocking or fuzzy logic, and all of these other things that you could do, right, with artificial intelligence. And then usually I had a model at like Sunday afternoon when the Australian markets would open, right, Sydney, and then it goes 24 hours, and then I would have like 12 models competing. By Wednesday, they would have been whittled down to 6. And usually by Friday, I usually just have 1 or 2 running. And the most scary part is when you're on a Friday and there is just one model left and has not made a single win, and then suddenly before you know it, it just makes this one trade that saves all of your trades for the whole
week. Well then that's a successful experiment, right?
Yeah, but that was consistently like that. So you don't have to take a look, you have to make it compete in the landscape. But where it could not compete, Jason, because it was training on old data, right? Or if it were unsupervised, it really cannot anticipate what the ECB minister is going to say. The European Central Bank minister is going to say. And in fact, that was my entree into currency trading, is losing $30,000 in the first 2 minutes of my very first trade. So because Trichet, who was then the ECB when I was minister when I was trading, just said something that sent the markets really tumbling, and it just went on for about an hour. So I learned to stop my models before major news announcements. However, it's become crazy after that. It goes on with the technology. As the technology gets more and more connected, you see that and all of these signals, are being given out at various times of the day. It's so difficult now for the models to actually catch anything that's going on, right?
Just because things are so interconnected with the global.
Yeah, and people are putting out bits and pieces. Yeah. Look, Elon Musk would say something about dog e-coin and dog e-coin.
Right.
It's fantastically crazy, right? So
or do the stock target, like the target price for Tesla at like 420 or something like that.
Oh well, that's because his girlfriend, right? For
he got yokoed.
And then at 45, my friend who taught me about finance, he is Wayne Silby. Of course, he's the one who started the whole socially responsible investing movement, and it's now called it's now called impact investing. Right? They've renamed.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware of it.
Yeah. He's my BFF here in DC, and we talk every time. And he came to my house and he said, "Ted, you're playing a zero-sum game. Time to return to humans and apply the values that you've had before you even went on currency trading." So I thought about this seriously, and I went back to a conversation that we had when I was 35 years old. He said, "Ted, where do you think medicine is going?" And I said, "I think it's going into regenerative medicine, into health, away from disease and all of this." And And I was looking for like a course here in the United States that I could take. And unfortunately, they didn't have anything on nutritional medicine. And, we only have 3 hours of nutrition in med school. So I went to Paris, and there I actually got another double certification, one in interventional endocrinology, or anti-aging medicine, as they call it here in the US, and the other one in nutritional medicine. But I still thought that the whole process was still geared towards disease. Like, you take the supplements if you have this, right? Why can't we take our bodies to shop and say we want it for maintenance? And at the time, I noticed that the technology already existed. It's like, what's common to all the organs in the body? And it's the cell, right? And can we take a look now inside the cell? Because when we were in medical school, we just have to memorize everything in biochemistry, and then we passed that whole thing. But now it's like you can now check the molecules inside and their levels, like your levels of vitamin A, C, E. You don't have to guess anymore. That technology is like 40 years old. It's now reaching our clinics, right? But then doctors who are on illness medicine essentially are geared towards diagnosis and treatment of disease. Rather, in other words, we're geared towards repair. And
absolutely, that's driven me crazy for a long time.
Yeah,
me being who I am, as you can imagine, I've constantly been like, well, how, and it's the same with psychology. It's like, how can we go for better? How can we optimize? I don't want to.
Yeah. So I said, well, I think, so my analogy there, or the metaphor that I use, is your indicators in your car, right? At the time that we were training, we didn't have the proper indicators for detecting your tire pressure, or detecting, that your oil is low, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And that's illness medicine. He doesn't have those gauges, but now we do. And that's by, there's a thing called the Human Metabolome Database that does that. And we have all the metabolites being cataloged, right? Including the toxins that are in system. And I said, well, it's time to put this in. Right. And so instead of diagnosing and treating disease, I said, let's detect and correct imbalances. But you see here, Jason, I've never strayed far from my network-centric point of view, because what's necessary when you want to shift into health, for example, is to take a look at the body, not as a person, but you have to go closer, right? You have to take a look at it as an ecosystem of cells that's working together. And when you look beyond the eyes, nose, ears, throat, and just go inside the cell, you see that they're doing something different, right? Mm-hmm. And they are, since the cell is fundamentally composed of a nucleus, mitochondria, cytoplasm, cell membrane, etc., no one's taking care of the fundamental health of those. And I said, well, it's time, because we now have a way of detecting and correcting imbalances. So instead of diagnosing and treating disease, I created health optimization medicine for detecting and correcting imbalances right now at the level of metabolome. And people have challenged me, and they said, well, Ted, what about subtle energy and all of these other things? And I said, if you can give me a reliable method of detection of subtle energy, I said, as of now, we have so many of these gadgets that say, oh, this is a chi generator and this and that, and it will improve your this and that. I said, give me something measurable. I said, and so because it is that way that we can put this whole thing under the big tent. I mean, it becomes acceptable in illness medicine. It becomes reimbursable with insurance and so on, right? Because in the end, it's the patient or the client, if they're not sick, that should be benefiting from this, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think, in terms of subtle energy, I think that even for me, that's a bit of a non-starter. But I think that, obviously I've thought about this quite a bit as well, and particularly with the interest that I have. The best that I've come up with in terms of what's measurable is just neurofeedback, right? And particularly under meditation. That's very measurable and can be used to correct, I think, correct for imbalances, as you pointed out, potentially, but certainly for cognitive optimization. And that's something that I have my students do quite a bit. Even with just commercial grade neurofeedback stuff like the Muse, but there's better ones available now, like the Emotive, and there's obviously and then professional grade equipment, which is hard to get get access to for most people. But then there's that, right? So that for me is where quantification can really come into the more subtle realms of things, but I'm not looking for chi apps or something like that.
Yeah, when I was actually doing this, it's like, in fact, I just had a question from one of my former trainees this morning, and she's an OBGYN who's now practicing health optimization medicine. And she said, Dr. Ted, can we use the metabolites of the neurotransmitters as a marker? I said, absolutely, right? Because now, before you have to bore a hole in the skull and then get a biopsy of the brain, to get neurotransmitter levels. Now you could actually detect the level in the pee, correlate it to the level in your plasma, and you have basically a fair idea of what it looks like in the brain. For example, Jason, for people who when you interview them, they say they're not depressed, right? But you obviously know that they're highly stressed out, and you could see that they're using up their serotonin really, really such that the serotonin metabolites essentially start rising, like drastically, the metabolite, meaning it's being used like crazy. And that they're actually responding to they're trying to deal with something that is emotionally stressful, right? And they need, to boost serotonin levels, etc., even if the metabolite shows that it's very high. So these are the kinds of things that you can find out in those things. And as being someone who has always worked with the brain and has always been fascinated by it, a lot of the things that have fascinated me about it is actually in terms of the consciousness, right? And that's why I was very interested in meditation and so on. And it's because of the focus that you can get from meditation, right? If you are looking at basically concentrative types of meditation, not the contemplative types of meditation, then you could develop. It's a skill. I tell my students it's a skill. That you could develop fairly quickly.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you, and that's what I tell everyone. Also, people often can have a very precious idea about spirituality or whatever they want to call it, just because it's just they associate it with feel good aphorisms and candles and things like that. And I tell people, no, it's just like going to the gym, particularly meditation. It's something that can be built up, that anybody can do, that doesn't rely on your special status as a person or something like that. So
I call it a mental gym. You go to your physical gym to work out. You go to your mental gym. Right, and if you have anabolic steroids for your physical gym, your psychedelics are your meditation steroids.
Nootropics, probably psychedelics. Control, but yeah.
There was one of the most difficult questions I got when presenting health optimization medicine is actually came from a psychiatrist who asked me, okay, Dr. Ted, your model is very simple, detect and correct imbalances. I get that, it's like 1, 2, 3. You measure the metabolites, you compare them to the ranges when you were between 21 and 30 years old, because that's your optimal level, right? Mm-hmm. And then you bring them back to those levels. Okay, fine. He said it's easy.
It's a good sales pitch.
yeah, it's easy. He said, but he said, how do you include, taking care of the spirituality of a person? And I said, we're dealing with metabolites and molecules here, right? And said, we know that DMT is the spirit molecule. So I said, essentially, a person who lacks spirituality is just exhibiting the DMT deficiency syndrome. So just give the person
that sounds like a good way. That coining a syndrome sounds like a good way to get a legal DMT prescription. I'm all for that. I have DMT deficiency. Oh, well, just hop down to your local pharmacy and pick up this prescription. Healthcare covers it. It's like, yeah, it sounds good to me. Brilliant, Dr. Ted. See what you're doing there.
But when I like the way you phrase it in your interview. The swim is someone who isn't me.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's not mine. That's from certain forums on the internet.
Yes.
Someone I met is
so someone who I met, someone who isn't me, right, in the forums. But someone who I met, no, no, actually, I've taken ayahuasca, and I was it was so toxic to me because
you said ayahuasca or
ayahuasca,
like
actually,
standard straight up.
Because I used the harmala alkaloids, and it was really these are non-reversible MAO inhibitors, right? And it turns out that when I got my gene profile, I really, if you want to kill me, you can give me, a bottle of Zantac and I'd be dead. I cannot detoxify these things very quickly. So I have an enzymatic deficiency. And I said, there must be a better way of doing this and introducing this to people who might want it. And being trained in pharmacology, someone who I met actually extracted the DMT crystals in his kitchen. Okay. And then using a reversible MAOI as a drug, which I found is actually not sold in the US, but it's sold in Europe and elsewhere. I was able to get a good titration, and I basically created what's called a pharmacologist regimen. So it's sort of like mimics the thing. But being a pharmacologist, I like to know exactly what's going into my system, and people hate that because in cannabis they like the entourage effect and so on and so forth. But no, I'd like mine to be a lot more controlled and take out a lot of the cultural stories that are woven into the practice, right?
That's because a great point right there. I really agree with that. I mean, it's like, I will preface this by saying that I'm not even particularly that interested in psychedelics anymore. But I think that because I was for someone I met was for so long. I think that, but that point right there about extracting the cultural stories is really important because obviously previously there was the hippie kind of thing on it, which I actually think is in some ways a lot better than the current cultural narrative. Well, now it's getting a lot more accepted, but now the narrative around it is kind of the Tim Ferriss narrative, and nothing against him. I love Tim Ferriss, but the kind of the narrative of like, how can we use this to work better in a corporate environment, with microdosing LSD and things like this, where it's like, man, that is that's a step down in my opinion. Well, it's good if it gets a broader adoption. But I think that I agree with you where we need to look at these things about.
I'm looking more. I don't like to put in like what does it really do in terms of more of a Sasha Shogun type of curiosity.
Oh yeah.
That kind of curiosity. Like, what does this really do? And without the story or the baggage around it, right? And because the stories are incredible. But the use of it, I think the use of psychedelics at full dose, I think is that you get to experience what it is to be egoless or selfless for a period of time, right? And then now you know what that feels like. Now you can bring that into meditation, where you could feel your ego or yourself arising, right? I call the ego a self-referential system because the ego as a word has a lot of connotations, right? And people use it as a noun, whereas it's a process, right? It's a selfing process. The self point. So I use it as a self-referential system. And what you do, for me, is like, well, that's the one of the greatest values, I think, of psychedelics that taken at full dose is that you experience what it is to be egoless or selfless, right? But at the same time, that also changes the contents of your consciousness, right? You see all these visions and so on and so forth. For me, that is actually a drawback, right? Because you should be able to maintain that kind of awareness or be awake, so to speak, or have this awareness of awareness in normal waking life. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you should be able to see, for example, it's a good exercise to do that. So you know what it felt to be like when your self-referential system begins to rise.
Yeah.
And in fact, Jason,
I love that language. Yeah. I just want to call it like this. So you're saying self-referential system begins to arise. That's great. Yeah. And so when you say self-referential system, it's basically it's almost as if the linguistic process in your mind is thinking about itself as an independent entity from the other things around.
From the other things, yes.
And that's the inherent process that is the quote unquote ego, but that it's not a thing. It's
process. The way I look at it, Jason, it's really very simple. It's easy for you to get because you have this clarity of the way you.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk a bit more, so we can.
Sure. I'd like to actually just say a bit historically. I told you in my research that I was looking for is there a network that says now I feed, now I mate, now I move, right? And turns out that I couldn't find such a network. And I thought that was consciousness that I was looking at. No, that was actually, that was my big error there. I was looking at the self, right? That self-referential system, the one that says or has the feeling that says, now I want to feed, I want to move, now I want to mate. And so going back now and looking at all the developments in where the self is situated, where the self-referential is situated. You've heard a lot about the default mode network as the most possible seat of the ego, right? And
they're finding that psychedelics loosen that. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is psychedelics actually decrease the blood flow to that area. Okay. So for me, it's more like it's dampened down, right? Because it's like a central conductor, right? It inhibits many stimuli so that you're able to focus in this physical dimension. This is where you focus on. So the way I see it is actually very simple. If you have like a series of lights, right, in a circle, and there's one light blinking and another light blinking and another light blinking, and then they go in synchrony, and you finally see a circle, right? And that's the self-referential system, right? When it's not doing its symphony, it doesn't exist, right? It's just a process whereby it arises, it fades away, it rises, fades away. In fact, Fadiman's newest book on multiple selves, right? We have so many selves that just go on and off and on and off, depending on it's depending. I call them roles. I call them, these are our egoic roles or self-referential roles. Jason as the interviewer, Jason's the magician, Jason as the one waiting for the bank teller, Jason, and so on. It's like these are roles, and just being able to, one of the things early on that I realized is that just being able to recognize that you are actually thinking while you're waiting, it's just like, oh, these are the thoughts that arise while I'm waiting. And that recognition, I think, is already a sufficient switch to wake up, to what I call a meta-awareness, right?
Absolutely. I think it'd be good to maybe talk about that a bit and distinguish. I'm interested in your thoughts about this, to distinguish the two different things here, because on one hand, we're talking about the self-referential process of the of ego, which is basically linguistic, right? It's like linguistic self-reference. And then at least that's how I look at it. It's the nature of it is language. And then as if you're talking to yourself, as if you're another person, which then concretizes the idea that there's this other concrete self in there that you're talking to. But that is, in a sense, self-awareness. But then we talk about, if you want to talk about more awakened states, where you're self-aware, but more or less in silence, right? It's called awareness, right? But they're both self-referential processes, perhaps. I don't know. How do we distinguish those?
Okay, this is just the way I think about it, right? It's just one of the older ones who did studies on consciousness. I think one of the things that we have failed to define here, and there is no definition, right, is that of consciousness, right? We Robin Carhart Harris in his papers has the same definition as I did when I presented mine, 30 years ago, which is that which goes away when you go into a deep dreamless sleep or where you're under anesthesia and, returns when you wake up.
Which I would disagree with, but
that's his definition.
Another state of consciousness. This is in the Hindu or the Vedantic model. It's like, well, it's just another phase of consciousness, right? That's like saying the sun goes away when it's on the other side of the earth.
No, but for me, Jason, I call that the medical definition of consciousness, right? Okay. That's a medical definition of consciousness, meaning you're essentially, if you're looking at the medical definition of consciousness, then Mark Solms, I think just published his book where he basically says that, consciousness is basically essentially three things. One is essentially interoceptive, which is a sleep-wake kind of thing, right? And the other one, and in medicine, when we say you're awake, that's it, right? And then the next one is exteroceptive, meaning you're responding to signals in the environment. And in medicine, we call that alert, right? And the next part of it is abstractive, and it's like, what's your name? My name is Jason, right? So and what day is it? And so you're oriented. So in medicine, we encapsulate that definition of consciousness as alert, awake, and oriented, right? And that's medical. So there's the Glasgow Coma Scale and so on and so forth. But if you go away from medical definitions of consciousness, right, and into consciousness itself and what are the theories behind it, in fact, there are two competing theories that are being investigated right now, where there's a $10 million prize, right, for that's being given out by the Templeton Foundation, and yeah, it's very easy to explain this. The one is what's called the global workspace theory of consciousness, right? Where you have inputs, your sensory inputs goes to a certain workspace, and as they're being parceled out to these units of the brain where they should go and process these things, it gives rise to consciousness. And the way I view this is an emergent view of consciousness. Right, so it emerges from the information processing system. The other one is called the integrated information theory, and this is a little bit harder to explain. But it's something like if you have an input to a certain network, right, and the network can feed back upon itself to cause a change in state, right? Mm-hmm. So you experience consciousness, and so this one actually has a lot more implication because it says that consciousness is inherent, right? In a system, it's just a matter of scale. So a thermostat would have a different level of consciousness to us, because of the number of networks that can go feedback loops. If they don't feedback on each other and they don't change state, then there's less information and therefore conscious. However, there are other theories of consciousness, but like the first order consciousness and the higher order theories. But the interesting thing about the integrated information theory is that it's been blasted because is an atom conscious or is a bat conscious, and when you look at it, it becomes rapidly panpsychic, right? Is consciousness basically fundamental property of the universe? It's just a matter of degree, right? And to what? And for me, it's more like when looking at this, it's like. Yeah, my argument 30 years ago is like, you don't know that a rock is conscious because you cannot become a rock, right? And the other thing that we seem to, and this is a big thing that I think is being neglected, is that we don't know where to put life in and its definition.
Right. I was going to say, I mean, this definition of consciousness obviously is very friendly and leaves the door open to artificial intelligence, particularly things like evolutionary algorithms, which can, change their, are self-referential in a sense and can change themselves.
Yeah.
My earlier point about the sleeping state is that, I think that we have a very, very much a bias towards the waking conscious state and thinking, and that in itself is part of the issue. And the point I was making about Vedanta is that their model of phases of consciousness is simply the waking state, waking state, dreaming state, sleeping state, deep sleep, as you mentioned, which I don't think is non-conscious. I think it's another type of consciousness. Yogananda thought that was the ideal state to be in meditation or in sleep. So sleep, dreaming, waking, dreaming, sleep, and then the meta level, which is silent self-awareness, which the goal for, as you know, the goal for Vedantic and Buddhist meditators of the deepest sense is to unify the thread of consciousness of meta-awareness between all three. So it's uninterrupted. So that they're in the Turiya state, I think is what it's called.
Yeah. So, I think we should go on a more fundamental, you already discussed, basically an entire semester's course in Advaita Vedanta, but
it's simple to me. Just waking, sleeping, dreaming. And then aware. Not too complicated, but
no. Jason, I think in if you take a look at it from, I always, I'm looking at it since I'm a scientist and a doctor and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. If you look at it from philosophical point of view, essentially, you could see consciousness basically arise from basically two schools of thought, right? Two modes of philosophy. One is the physicalist, right, or physicalist or the physicalist monism, as they call it. Where everything is basically reducible to what we are and what we do, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of these models that we're testing right now are basically in the reductionist mode because they were in the physical monism. But the other one is called idealism, and this is a philosophical idealism, not the idealism as a word as we know it, but idealism where everything is consciousness in the first place, right? There is no experience that is out of consciousness. So everything which is more Advaita Vedanta, right? More Dzogchen.
I was going to say Dzogchen, and I think this would be a good place to segue into that. Because it seems to me, I know you have a background in Buddhism and Dzogchen and even Bon, which I really want to talk about because that's the super fun stuff. But I think, I just, in listening to you, there's a lot of Buddhist worldview and a lot of the things you're saying, even when you were talking about looking at networks between cells and things like that. And your view of you're using the word arising, the view of the ego as an arising phenomenon. There's a lot of Buddhist thought in there, and that's often where I come back to as well. Just the idea of looking at networks rather than monism, as you're saying, or reductionism, which I don't think. I think that particularly Western philosophy and science hit a dead end with that. Shortly after Descartes, and we've been slowly absorbing Buddhism ever since on every level. Cultural, scientific, mathematical, even, and I think that.
The world's major neuroscientists will disagree there, but
okay. Well, tell me about that then, because I'm just a guy that runs a magic school. So let me know.
No, because they're still looking, right? They're looking for the neural correlate of consciousness, okay. And that's where the efforts are in the neuroscientific world, right? That's where the efforts are. But really,
towards finding the physical correlate.
Where's the correlate of consciousness?
And what's the state of that? Where is that at now? I don't know. I'm super curious.
The state of that is actually with the competition that I told you with the $10 million prize, the global workspace theory, which assumes that maybe they will find the activity of the brain will be in the frontal part of the brain at the prefrontal cortex, and the integrated information theory, they will find that the major centers.
Where does that leave animals then who don't have that particularly developed or at all?
We're just doing humans for now. So
I'm just saying, it's like if you find it in humans but not animals, it's like animals are
that's why
conscious,
Yeah, that's why the model for one is basically an information processing model, like the global workspace theory, and the other one is feedback and feed forward network for the other. So we're still looking at a network as a substrate of things. But as I said, the interesting one, which has been pilloried a little bit by some of the major scientists, is integrated information theory, because it has some panpsychic repercussions. And I don't see but the whole thing here, Jason, is really, for me, it's very simple. I really, however the whole thing goes out, whether it's physicalist or idealist and so on, I think, for example, in meditation, having the skill of the awareness of awareness is very useful, right? You are aware of being aware.
Well, it's the goal. It's at least an initial. It's the initial goal, and that's why I was hoping to distinguish the awareness of awareness from the self-referential process of the ego, because in a sense, self-referential processes, but perhaps at different levels, or right.
Yeah, I get you, and that's why I call, instead of calling, in Dzogchen, you have the sky, right? Their favorite meditation.
I like
of the sky, and then the clouds are the thoughts, and so on and so forth. And even in Buddhism, a thought is just one of the senses, right? They consider it one of the senses that just arise there, and so essentially, when we have a term for, when I look at you and our eyes lock together more than what is socially acceptable, we begin to have this massive sense of self-awareness, right? That someone is looking at me and so on. And that developed evolutionarily, of course, right? Because of our evolution as social creatures. You have to have a way of basically, when you abut against something or someone with which you have a relationship, right? Like your job or your significant other, or or a memory, you could see that this self-referential system arises, because I think language is just one component of it. And if you look at it just from a brain standpoint, say, and I described it as this circle of lights, right? That will light up and be in synchrony. It will pull in from your memory, right? It will pull in from your emotions. It will pull in from your planning for the future and so on, until you have this blinking lights that's all up there. And the way I tell my students to actually realize this, the happening of the self-referential system booting up, is when they wake up in the morning. When they're open their eyes and it's newly open, there's a slight disorientation really on where you are. You just take a look, right? Before it actually comes to you that, this is especially prolonged when you've been traveling a lot and you don't know what city you're in. You open your eyes and you go, right? And then you see the whole thing constructing itself, and it's like, oh, this is where I am.
And then you think, oh God, what did I say last night? What have I done?
The worst thing is like, oh God, who is this person beside me?
That can be the best thing too. I mean,
but it's like, I don't know your name. But anyway, that's the self-awareness, or the ego, the self-referential system, right? It has your autobiographical memory and so on, and it will essentially pull all of these things. But what is actually what I call meta-awareness, which is in Dzogchen and Advaita and so on, is that awareness of awareness. And that awareness of awareness, as I tell my students, is really very simple to experience, right? Even without psychedelics, right? When
ideally without psychedelics, you shouldn't need to drive a Mack truck through your consciousness in order to get the most fundamental thing,
Well, it's called ordinary consciousness, right? And in Buddhism, that's called ordinary consciousness. And I said, in an extreme of it, I said, here's what happens. I said, when you really absolutely have to pee, and you cannot find a place to pee, and then you finally are able to pee. I said, the initial part when the stream comes out, you're not thinking of anything. You're just experiencing you're totally aware. There is no self in that.
Pure bliss.
Right? Yeah. Because, the awareness of awareness for me is really freedom from the illusion of the self, right? That's how I define waking up or being awake, or the meta awareness, as I call it, is a freedom from the illusion of the self. And at a particular point in time, you're basically from the self. It's just like you're just really attentive towards your relief, and everything else is going on. There's no self going on in there.
The big revelation for me was always that it was not only that, is that you don't actually need the self to function. And in fact, that you function better without it, without the constant nagging self-referential internal dialogue. Once that's away, it doesn't detract, because people, particularly with psychedelics, they're afraid their initial fear when they're very new, or with meditation, is, oh, what if I lose myself? Right. Well, it turns out, if you lose yourself, if you do it correctly with long-term meditation and not in a drug experience that you can't handle at that moment, that it actually increases your ability to function. I think the same as athletes who are trained so they do things without thinking. That's where all human genius comes from, I think, is when people get out of their own way and they allow it to arise.
However, we are programmed out of that, right? And the analogy that or the example that I like to set is, what has been said as, as a child, we actually have this open awareness, right? The whole world is part of us. And, we don't know where our boundaries end and the world begins, and so on and so forth. But then you start looking at yourself in the mirror, and then your parents said, that's you. It's like, then you're basically putting on this image that this is you, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the development of your self-referential system. And, So essentially, what you're doing is, when you are going back into your meta awareness, is actually removing that, which has been placed there, and recognizing that you are actually the one that's free, right? The one that's free from the self illusion. And I think much of the part where people stumble on, which is I think easy to remedy, is when you keep on using ego as a noun, you're gonna stumble on, right? But when you say it's a process, like it's a self-referential system, it's a processing system, then suddenly it becomes just something that arises because of our functioning. And being able to see how it arises, etc., allows us to make better decisions, allows us to be less reactive to things, and this is what I think is necessary for me, for my understanding of clinging and aversion, right? The desire and so on. It's like you can, because you have developed this meta awareness, and it's a skill, right? It's basically you're shifting your identity away from your self-awareness into the meta-awareness. It's just like, no, that's not me. This is actually me, right? And when you shift that, you begin to see your desires go. It's like, oh, and then it's going to melt away, and your aversion is going to melt away. And then pretty soon you're seeing all of this aggregation of desires and aversions, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, and you begin to see, what sort of mental habits you have formed over time. Right?
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that's perfect. That's perfectly articulated, right? And I think that it also, there's so much that particularly people who are already on the other side of this or are more practiced in this or more familiar with these ideas take for granted. And one thing that I want to point out is I think one of the critical things there is the most important part of that process often is it's not just, well, let me put it this way. In order to get into a position where you are now observing things arise, whether it's the process of the ego or aversion or attachment or just emotions or whatever it happens to be, you by definition have to be outside of that circuit. You have to be in meta-awareness. And that's the critical part because now the most critical part of that is now your center of gravity that you perceive as yourself is now in that instead of in the processes themselves where you're subject to them, where you think it's you, where you're caught in the windstorm, of all this stuff arising. So I think the most critical part is just to get into the meta awareness, and then even just like the kind of Zen cone nature of some of these practices, or encouraging people to even encouraging people to simply observe their thoughts already implicitly pushes them into a meta-awareness position. And that's the important part, I think.
Well, you know about that study, right? Where people were in an experiment and they were actually, you get left alone with your thoughts, and more than 50% of them would rather electrocute themselves.
It's amazing, right? I don't understand that at all because I've been an introverted person my whole life, but I don't understand it. Like, for instance, like, in LA, like I would go to like sensory deprivation places, and I would talk to the people there who were all very much like on this level, and they would say like, you would be amazed. Well, this is particularly LA, which is perhaps the most extroverted city on the planet, but they would say like, you would amaze how terrified people have never spent half an hour by themselves without chatter or phone or other people, or being, everyone wants to be on stage in LA, but it's like people are, and that's bizarre to me because it's like, it's so natural to me to be, and always has, meditation or not. I was always a bookworm kid, and I was, born in a family of intellectuals. So it was like, I was always in my own internal world, meditation or not. So that's just like alien to me. But I think you're right. It's like most people are terrified of being alone. Like they say the number one fear is public speaking, but I think that people are more scared of being with themselves.
Yeah, people are
right there.
People don't like to be left alone with their thoughts, and and there's something in particular I actually like to emphasize here. One of the crucial things that happened to us in evolution is the development of language. And our development of language actually either was for the good of us and fucked us up in a lot of ways, really, in being able to observe ourselves, right? For example,
virus from outer space.
For example, one of the experiences that I have when I am in meditation, right, is just observing the chatter, and you just know that, oh, that's how my brain works, right? That's the chatter right there. And what happens is when the ego engages is when it gets into the meaning of what it's saying, right? Instead of just hearing the sound that it's chattering, when you start engaging in what it's saying, the ego is beginning to basically get you back to the self-awareness.
That's like quicksand. It's like quicksand, fighting quicksand. Yeah.
I like the way that Sam Harris actually presents this. He says, when you are actually meeting a dear friend of yours, and the friend of yours goes, I can't believe you did that to me. It's like, right? And then you go, what? What did I do? And at that particular moment, everything is self-awareness, right? It's like there is no space around the self-awareness, and from you're an experienced meditator, etc. And I don't know how this will resonate with your listeners, but I think you will understand what I mean when I go, here's an organic robot that's actually spewing out something, right? And the way I look at it is, see, there's a program running, and I am understanding what it's saying, and here are the list of responses that are coming up for me without actually engaging or having my whole emotion and everything else involved, right? In it. It's like you're able to keep it with, as a psychiatrist before teased me, he said, you have a mild, dissociative disorder. And it's like there's but still you have empathy, right? You know that you have to address, etc. But your whole attention doesn't get eaten up, by the meaning of what's being said. Rather, there's a space around what's being said and saying that here's another person that's running his or her program and saying this to me, right? And here is the possible things that how I can basically not react to it, but respond to it, right? And in fact, the way I teach this is, if you just want to say something, count to 3. So 1001, 1002, 1003, just keep your mouth shut. So instead of reacting, you're actually responding. And I keep on telling them the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is that your entire attention is gobbled up by your self-referential system.
Yeah, I agree. I often when I'm in my best moments, I strive to, or I would like to even take it further, which is that I think that language itself is a bounded system, right? It's like you're talking about running programs. It's like, well, if you're running the code, whatever language, whether the English language or any other language, right? If you're running, this was always William Burroughs' point, which I think is so critical, which is that it's not the meaning that is expressed within the symbolic set. It's running the symbolic set at all. So if whether you're talking with somebody else or talking to yourself using English, you've already accepted a finite set of responses.
Yes.
And there's standard responses that are conditioned into that, not only by the language, but by the entire canon of all Western all media used within the English language, whether it's movies or books or just your interactions with other people throughout your whole life using that language, which is why people's brains change so radically when they learn a different language.
Yeah.
But Burroughs' whole point, what you're talking and what you were just saying about, language was a good and a bad period of development. It's like the Tower of Babel and the Garden of Eden. And this was always the great goal of the Western magicians as well. It's like John Dee and all throughout the Renaissance, as you know, like their goal was to get back to the language, like the primal language. But I think that even that, I think that it's to get to a pre-linguistic or a post-linguistic state, perhaps. And this is what meditation does so effectively. It gets us out of not just the ego, because the ego is just a subset of how one uses language with oneself, right? And all the assumptions that are carried. So the assumption is not just that there's another self listening. The assumptions are all baked into the computer code you're running to do so in the first place, which is the language, right? Which is not neutral.
Yeah, it's not at all. Many, many years ago, as you know, I grew up in the Philippines, and I was curious about the blues, right? The American music, the blues, and there was no equivalent in the country, and that actually
I very much want to visit the Philippines.
I
have a lot of friends from there. I grew up with. I know a lot of people even from where I grew up. I want to visit there's a lot of stuff I want to see there, particularly the whale sharks.
Well, consider yourself invited, Jason.
Oh, thank you. Do you live there now?
No. My home base is Washington, D.C. And I haven't gone. I practice health optimization medicine there 4 times a year, 30 days each, basically a month every quarter. So I go there for 30 days every quarter. So about 4 months there. And then some of the time I spend in Europe. You have to keep your roots, right, in terms of your educational roots and connections. And then part of the time moving out here in the US. In fact, what I used to say is heaven for me is spending more than 2 weeks in a single time zone. But now and people will hate me for this because, with the pandemic, I couldn't move, right? So it's like, so Ted, are you in heaven? But actually I am. It's nice to be grounded for a while. I slacked before. I used to, before the pandemic, I slacked. I basically was just reading 1 book a week. When the pandemic set in, I was back to 1 book a day. Boom, boom, boom. It was just fun. Yeah. But as you were saying about language, what's in fact, some of my initial studies in artificial intelligence were in language. Counting the ZIF counter, where you count the number of letter A's and letter E's and the occurrence of certain words and so on. Those were some of the things that I was trying to do when beginning to understand it, and then taking a look at essentially what the effectively looking at studies from other countries, because the US is basically very America-centric, right? In terms of its medicine.
To say the least.
In terms, in fact, I encourage my medical students to go out in the world, because U.S. medicine is not the whole of medicine.
You almost said U.S. medicine is not medicine.
I did. No, U.S. medicine is basically acute medicine. If you have trauma, like that needs surgery, or you have acute infections, you're perfect. But when you're in chronic diseases, you better look elsewhere, or have an enlightened physician with you. But what I was looking at there is taking a look at, for example, how all of these different cultures were actually, like, for example, when I was basically 2 years doing a fellowship in Paris and traveling there, etc. The children are quadrilingual, and you could see their grasp of things are so much different. And the point of view is so much wider, right? And for me, I attributed that, it has a wider sense of neural connections and so on that can travel and can see.
Europeans laugh at us also, because we literally don't know about anything outside of I say we, but most Americans don't know more than one language and don't know about anything that happens outside of America. It's people.
Well, one of the things that actually shocked me is that advertisement where there was sushi and the guy said, "You better cook that." But anyway,
when was this? What was it?
It's an advertisement. It's a common. It's an ad. I don't. I think it's still playing sometimes, but I don't remember. I recall that, but I recall that. But that kind of thing, it's supposed to be funny, but for me, it isn't, right?
Right.
But that it shoehorns your perspective, right? It shoehorns your perspective into one set or one lens by which you cannot pull out. And what I tell my students really is that, I've been mentoring students and I'm learning from them tremendously. I said, perspective is like a diamond. There are so many facets of it. You can shove yourself into one, like the Western or the American perspective, but make sure you pull your head out of it and go and take a look at another facet and shove it yourself and take a look again in there. See what you find and pull out. But all in all, is that you're looking at a gem. In fact, the poem for my book that I published was "The Blind Man and the Elephant." Right? Someone sees it as a rope, someone sees it as a tree, someone treats it as a snake, and so on. And I think in meta awareness, you're actually able to see the entire elephant. Right, and you're able to see the entire jewel, right? And you're also able to see that you're actually viewing the world in various lenses. It's sort of like all these lenses are coming up, in this sphere of awareness, and for me, your meta awareness, I agreeing with you. Your meta awareness for me is the most important thing there is. Right? If we can equate like meta awareness to what they call consciousness, in a big sense, then it's for me, it's really what determines the quality of your life, right? Whether or not you're craving or averse to something, et cetera, it's all manifested in there, right? And as you said, the self is not necessary to be able to do that, but being able to engage the self, or to being, Jason, who is going to play the role of X, knowing that you're going to play the role of X, like Dr. Ted plays the role of physician, plays the role of teacher, plays the role of this, knowing that you are playing those roles with that recognition and awareness makes a fundamental difference with the quality of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that for me is where, true magic comes back in, not in the superstitious sense, but, it's one thing to be able to enter into meta awareness and stay there for long periods of time until it's entrained, which is, I suppose, the monastic experience or simply the long-term meditation experience. But it's then you can start having fun, which is putting on all these different masks and being aware that you're playing a role, even if you're doing it to get people's goat. It's like, even if you're doing it to rile people up by confronting their own, contradictory beliefs, which is where I always get in trouble by doing that, particularly on social media. But yeah, that's where the ritual masks come in.
Jason, I don't know, your monastically trained people here might really punch me on this one. Monastic training is a cop out, right? Because when you separate yourself from the rest of the world, it is easy. Things are easy when you're not in a monastery. I mean, God knows I have been in one. So, it's very easy. But when rubber meets the road,
yes,
man, that's the real test. And in fact, there's a joke, right? The real test of your enlightenment is, go see your family for Thanksgiving. See how fast.
Absolutely. And I think, no, you're right. And I agree with you. And I do think that the monastic experience is important as a stage. Absolutely. I mean, you've got to abstract yourself from your social relations also for a period of time in order to become clear about what's you and what's not, and enter the stream and enter the process and all of that. But eventually you have to come down from the mountain, and that might be leaving the monastic experience. It might be leaving behind all the training wheels and trappings of whatever tradition it was that you were studying within, and doing the world. And that's what I forced myself to do in my life, because I very easily could have done the opposite. And but I realized that I was just being a scaredy cat. I was afraid of jumping off the diving board, because you also don't know how real this stuff is until it comes into contact with everyone, with the unenlightened, broken, vast mass of the world, and also it's like, well, there's also a level where it's like, great, so you're self-aware, like, so what? Like, everyone else is to a certain extent also, or could be if they stopped and wanted to. It's like, well, but what have you done? Like, what have you done for other people? Like, what is the point? And I think that we also need to, I think, resist the messianic thing, which is there's also this temptation, particularly when you're in that monastic experience, to go out and say, I am going to enlighten everyone now. I'm going to go out and change the world. And it's like, well, no, you're not, because that's not the way of things, and nor should it be. But you can maybe use your talents to do something helpful for people. I mean, like,
I'm more of the co-opted Stoic saying, in that regard, do what you can with what you have where you are. So, for example, in setting up, I said, what's wrong with medicine today? It's we're too disease-oriented, illness-oriented, and we're not health-oriented. I said, can I do something here, right? And so that's why I started my nonprofit. I mean, I started it over a decade ago. Yeah, and it's not being attached to the, for me, this is all about fun and learning. If I'm able to move the needle just a little bit, by using the bifurcation point, like just pulling a small lever, to shift, into health and away from disease. If it takes, it takes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not time, right? But you're doing what you can with what you have where you are.
That's what everyone just has to do, I think. Just do what's in front of them,
Yeah. But the thing is, I think the as I said, for me, the best magic is for at least for me, right? Is ataraxia or minimal perturbability, right? It's like I and this is just me. I don't like tidal waves of joy, and neither do I like deep whirlpools of sadness. I'm okay with gentle waves. And as you know, there's been an accusation, and it's probably true, that when you meditate, much as you're less responsive or reactive to negative emotions, you're also going to be less reactive to positive emotions. I said, I'll take that. I said, I'll take that. I
mean, the other side of that, there's always a hangover, it's like you act like you're at Disneyland all the time. I mean, first of all, it's annoying for other people to watch. And the other is there's going to be a hangover, but I think that just, I don't know if that's true, though. I'll say, I think that there's particularly because then you also have to ask, well, what are we measuring by? What's people's definition of happiness? And I think particularly in such a media saturated time in America, it's like, whether America or anywhere, I mean, people, their definition of happiness is like this ridiculous performative
I agree.
Outbursts of joy, like I'm so happy, like jump, like Tom Cruise jumping on the couch, on the Oprah show or whatever that was, like things like that. Or it's like that's that for me is not happiness. That's a manic episode. I think that like happiness is just it's like the sun shining in your life. It's like a solid.
Yeah, for me, it's dynamic equanimity. I think is the way I would define my personal definition of happiness. So when people ask me, I want to be happy, I said, "What's your definition of happiness?" Right? And I said, because that will determine exactly, how happy or sad you will be. So I said, for me, it's a dynamic equanimity. Meditation is known to decrease the sensitivity of your amygdala or your fear center, right? So you're less reactive to negative things, and it also increases your neocortical thickness, right? Even to older age. So you see all this physical or neuroscientific advantages, right? To that, but for me, it's more like the stability that it brings to you in being able to separate what you need from what you want, right? And that's a fundamental thing that I start with when I teach students is, do you need that or do you want that? Is it a need or is it a want? Because those are two separate things. And being able to see whether or not that's, why are you grasping at that? And, why are you averse to that? Right, and I know that a lot of magical systems would be, you break a boundary, right, in order to gain the expansiveness and the energy from it. And I'm writing another book, and it's more slow going. And I looked at your chapter on your references on Aleister Crowley and all of that, because I really am trying to see, what are the practices, that people have used, and in order to do this. And I see now it is, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I divided them into two. One is what I call the bioevolutionary programming. So you go against bioevolutionary programming by living an ascetic life, a life of celibacy, and so on. And that's going against, your bioevolutionary program. The other one is a socio-cultural program. You break the taboos of society, as Aleister Crowley did, or the Agors of the Agori of India, for example. And that's and it's a source of it's a source of power for them, or a source of an expansion of their
consciousness. Yeah. I mean, but that's not just a magical thing. I mean, that you can find that in obviously the Buddhist and Hindu Tantra. You can find it, as you mentioned, the Goris are masters of it. It's in the Russian Orthodox Church even, so.
Yeah. But I wanted to bring it down to the brain level, right?
Yes, great.
I wanted to bring down to the science level. Okay, here are your bioevolutionary programs. Here are social cultural programs. And if you take a look at, for example, the free will and the incompatibilist philosophies, right? You're being programmed, right? Your genes are already pre-programmed. You didn't choose them, right? And then your situation at the womb, as soon as you can hear your mom, for example, your brain is already getting programmed. Your body is already getting programmed. The stress that your mother feels is already programming you all the way to your birth and your socioeconomic condition and so on, right? And so that for me is more like you're basically starting off with that kind. You're already getting programmed even before you actually realize that you have an ego, you have a self-referential system in there.
Very deeply. I agree. I like your model. I agree with it. I would perhaps suggest something because you put it in the context of essentially going against biological processes. I would suggest that actually both of those do, because there's the monastic, because it's all about reproduction, right? And the monastic one is non-reproductive because it is
survival and reproduction.
Yeah, it's just like you're basically, the monastics cut the reproductive line. And that's why parents cry when they they hear that somebody's becoming a yogi, right? But then the other one you're discussing, like a kind of a left-handed or a transgressive approach. I think that is also, let's be honest, often involves sexual extremity and is also generally non-reproductive. It's also an attempt to cut the biological programming by going against, you said, the mores of society. Well, the mores of society always revolve around reproduction, right? So it's also an attempt to cut the reproductive line, or can be, and by doing shocking things, often changing sexual orientation has a big thing to do with that. Certainly did in the case of Crowley. But I think that I would like to add another path to that, which is simply the householder yogi path, which is going with the evolutionary current, having a career and having a family, but doing so with meta awareness and understanding that one is playing a role. And I think this is generally regarded as the hardest path, but I think it's also and it's not for everyone, but it's because it's very hard to do all of those things. It's a tall order to have a successful career, family, and spiritual practice. That's a lot, right?
I agree with you there, and because it's a most difficult and usually the most neglected, right? Because you need an entire community that supports the same idea.
Yes,
you need an entire community that actually does that path. You can't do it alone.
Or you adapt yourself to the one around you. But ideally, yes, but
because everyone will be going through these phases, right? Everyone will be going through. Now is the time to have kids. Now is the time to you earn money, and then you go, and then so it's all of these different stages to go through. And if everyone is agreed in the community that that's the phases to go through, then you actually have that support, right? Because people know that you are all in that together. And at least that's the way. Yeah. That's the way I see the householder path for doing that.
But that's always how it was, and it's how it was particularly in classic India. But we live in a fallen world now, so everyone's got to figure it out on their own. But I think that I do still think that it is possible, whether it's because we have the internet for social support as well, and people. That's generally where I urge my students towards. I also think that you mentioned that the monastic lifestyle is a cop out, and I agree. And I think that just to further agree with you, you were talking about reactivity. I think for me, the name of the game is non-reactivity. It's filing down that reactivity. So I'm with you on the same page there. That's getting into meta awareness and filing down attachment and aversion, so that you can get to solid state awareness. That's kind of the name of the game. And I think that the number one place to do that is not in a monastery, but it's in relationship, right? Whether primary intimate relationship, family relationship, community relationship. It's dealing with other people, right? So and that's in some ways where I think that the householder path is ideal, right?
I think
do it in a way.
I'd like to add something there, because I find all of these things very anthropocentric, very human-centric, and actually I've been really big on what's our relationship to Earth, your relationship to your environment, because we are, shaped by our environment and very open to it, and we have isolated ourselves from our connection to it, even if we aren't. Right. In fact, when I lecture on vitamin D, the first thing that I say, you are yoked to the sun, whether you like it or not. Right. And so for me, in terms of the bigger picture, Jason, when you're meditating and doing all these things, you begin to see exactly, what you see your desires and say, I will do this to have more money, and so I will use child labor, and so I will traffic humans.
That's what I meditate on, yeah,
and so on and so forth, right? So you could see that that. Then what happens, to all the plastics in the ocean and all of this and that, and we only have one spaceship right now, right? That we live in, and you see your relationships to that. So I've actually, when I become more careful in not saying what's your relationship to other people, etc. What's your relationship to your pets and to other animals in your house? What's your relationship? Yeah. So and you examine what's your relationship to your job, not your boss, but your job, right? Right. And how are you relating with your government? How do you view your government? Because that determines how you actually will respond to them.
I think also, how do you relate to your supply chain?
Yeah.
Where's the human, like you said, child labor, human trafficking? Like, if you look at all the computers that I'm doing all this on, it's all, there's child labor and human trafficking in that. The food, the cardboard, the plastic, it's like, there's no way to separate oneself from that. And we do need to become aware of that.
And this is a new audio studio, right? And that you have.
I actually built it with child labor. I came here no, I didn't. I actually broke my finger assembling it. But no, it was all me. But of course, it's like we have all these incredible toys, but they come from somewhere.
Yeah. So that relationship is, you have to examine it because it builds, as again, I said, you have to examine the perspective that you're looking. It's just one of the lenses you're looking at. And this came to me. I have a book that I never published because the publisher said doctors don't read, right? And it's geared towards doctors. But I was, when looking at
bizarre thing. I've heard some bizarre things from publishers. Like I've written things and they just said, it's too political. And then I'm like, well, in what way? Like, at least tell me I'm a bad writer. I mean, they didn't say that, so I guess I'm not. But they said it's too political. I'm like, well, can you say more? No. Okay. All right.
No, this editor loved it, but I was 2 chapters shy of finishing the book, and she said, doctors don't read. And I said, okay, I shelved it. But in there is actually, it's something about this disease causation, right, in medicine. In the beginning, when someone had a UTI, right, tract infection, it was painful, and they would attribute it to something magical, right? Like you peed on some dwarves in their home in the forest. Right?
Oh, that's right. That explains it then.
Right? Yeah.
I was wondering about this.
So now what's your treatment, right? You give some offerings in the elf mounds, of some food and stuff to appease them, right? So that's the way you did it. But when the religious people came about with their explanation, they would go, okay, that seizure is because of the demons, inside the body. And so trepanation, right? They put holes in the head to let the devil escape, right? And so
don't do that amazingly.
And then after that, it became empirical, right? Oh, the seizure is actually from hyperactive foci, electrical foci in the brain. Right. And then we went to a rational phase now where, the chances of you getting cancer from cigarette smoking is XYZ, or, for you sustaining an injury without a seatbelt is XYZ. And that's very statistical. The thing is, we don't, as human beings, we don't think statistically. And this is one of the things that's probably, for me, it's a useful tool for people who are meditating and doing all of these meta exercises. One tool that they could use logically, in daily life is taking a look at, how do I view this in statistical terms? When you're looking at when you're looking at a local first-person experience is fine. But when you're looking at a huge number of people and events, you cannot use your own intuition. Right? Like a very simple example is that most people would take their cars even if it's more unsafe to take a car than to take a plane. Right? So, because we don't, this is non-intuitive. And one of the things that
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I found very useful for you to be non-reactive, right, is to basically, as soon as you identify that you're reacting to something, does this require a statistical point of view? Right? Does this require a rational point of view? Let's just take, for example, and no offense to anti-vaxxers here, but it's just looking at any vaccine that has been ever produced or you've been vaccinated, etc. There is a certain percentage. Okay, say you vaccinate 1 million people and one person gets some side effect.
Sure.
Right? Yeah, it's like we statistically look at that. Is that acceptable? Right? Is that acceptable for oral polio vaccine? We determined that 1 in 10,000 is acceptable. right? And that's really high for me.
Very
right?
high. Yeah.
Right? It's 0.001%. So you could see that we have, and we cannot put this statistically in our heads. Like, look, you're looking at a pandemic now with all the vaccines getting rolled out, et cetera, et cetera. Just looking at it statistically, you will say, oh, instead of getting pushed emotionally on this and that issue, like, does this require rational type of thinking?
I agree. I think that this is one of the, I think that statistics or mathematics in general are another excellent tool in the same way that meditation is to get you out of reactivity, because it's like we by nature construct stories about reality from the data that we have. We just construct them from too small of data sets. So, particularly now with the internet connected world that we have, I mean, it is so incredible to actually get actual information about things. And like, I deal with this every day because I run a business. And if I run the business on decisions that are from my quote unquote gut feeling, generally those are bad decisions, contrary to what people think. The correct decisions are almost all statistical, but you need to get statistical significance. Of course, first you need a lot of data. And this, of course, brings up the questions of artificial intelligence, as artificial intelligence is by its nature a creature, intelligence created out of statistics and or large data sets that it's trained on. And so I think we're very quickly entering. Well, I would say we're quickly entering all that. Part of me thinks that the world should be run on pure data. Pure data. I mean, like even political decisions should be made on data. They should be, not to be cliche, but that we should have data-driven governance. But of course, there's a lot of ethical potentially pitfalls there. But there's also there's too many, as we see in America. We have an emotionally based, personality based political system, which is just utterly dysfunctional.
As long as the data are not biased, right? I'd like to say, as long as the data are not prejudiced. People like to use bias, but as long as the data are not prejudiced, right?
That's more clear. That's correct.
As has been complained about by facial recognition technologies, for example, and so cannot identify people of darker skin properly.
Absolutely, yeah. The bias and algorithms issue, and this is I think people are aware of this. Probably not as much as they need to be. I think that when I was working with Google on briefly with their artist and machine intelligence program on AI, my whole point that I was making was, which is certainly not unique to me, but which I was continuing to make, is that the bias is inherent in the cultural assumptions that go into the AI in the first place. And basically what I said to them is, you're building a god. So for the love of God, make it a nice god, right? If you make it like, the inherent assumptions that go into it, as we both know, often actually by definition, our assumptions about reality are usually totally scotomas. We're unaware of them. And that's very dangerous. And so the people that program the AI, particularly if it becomes an evolutionary algorithm and it begins self-training itself, well, the seed that goes into it is quite critical. We need to be very careful about that, because if we just put in the same assumptions that have got us where we are now, which is, a dominator, empire, that has built itself by completely depersoning others, right?
Yeah,
we're going to get more of that, but even more, So
you recall the news, right? The Microsoft chatbot that was just on for 12 hours. By the end of 12 hours, it became totally.
Like, imagine an AI that's trained on the whole internet. It's just going to be this like Nazi sex fetishist, It's like,
this is a documentary that I just saw on AI and bias, and we would expect this, especially for those that are doing unsupervised learning, right? Where if it's supervised learning, I remember doing supervised learning before, where you put in images of cancer cells and non-cancer cells, and actually training the system in a supervised way. But what we're doing now is black box, right? So we're doing unsupervised, and we don't know exactly how the weighting happens inside the generative artificial neural networks. But what I see going on here, as actually detailed by the documentary, is that China is going a different way, where they're actually taking the data from all of their citizens, and you're required to register and so on and so forth. That's the godlike thing. Well, what's more disappointing is the US, right? It's like, we're using AI to see whether or not I could get you to buy this type of shoes and that kind of bag and so on. So it's this totally different divide that's going on, right, in the particular.
Well, I think that maybe, but then again, it's like, who knows what's going on behind closed doors at companies? I think that, because obviously these Amazon, Facebook, Google have these unimaginably huge data lakes, as does the NSA and certainly China. But a lot of it is now because of COVID being volunteered. I mean, like in Israel, from what I understand, they instituted the vaccine passport system, and they were able to get everyone vaccinated right away. But one of the conditions of it was that they just volunteered everyone's medical information to Pfizer and these other companies in order to get it done faster. So they just volunteered everyone's data. And I know Google has been trying to get access to the NHS records forever. And I don't know where the state of that is, so that they can train, presumably, so that they can train AIs on it to, cure cancer and things like this. But who knows what else? Google also operates 23andMe, so they have all of that volunteer genetic data. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
Just two pieces here. One historic is when I was writing my neural circuitry database, or Connectome. I was at the Carnegie, and I wandered into a room, and I took a look at the screens, and it was like data of educational attainment and income and purchases and et cetera, history. And I looked at it, I said, wow, what's this? And I saw it was of a credit card company. Remember, this was 30 years ago. And
oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, so 30 years ago. Wow. And when a guard saw me, he basically just shoved me out of the room. Wow. He said, "You're not supposed to see that." So
you probably can't say which company it was on air, but I'm sure.
Even as early as that, right? Even as early as that time, we were already being watched, right? We just didn't know it. Right now, we just have a more awareness of our privacy. That's why all these things are coming out in the open. But they were already doing it at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly, starting in the 50s, the construction of this kind of technocratic society, but also, like, for instance, I was watching that Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War, and they're talking about they essentially built a rudimentary AI to try and tell them how to win the war in the basement of the Pentagon. They built a computer and they ran in all this data and stuff like this, and it gave them bad information. It basically said the war wasn't winnable, which turned out to be true. But there's a real danger in that, which they found out at the time, which is seeing. I mean, this is just cliched, but I mean, at the time it was very true. It's like they're just feeding in troop positions and number of ammunition counts and number of M16s and all this, and it's just like it very much. I think perhaps the most prophetic thing ever said about what will become the AI is Stalin. The death of one is a tragedy. The death of millions is just a statistic, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, the other point I wanted to make was that one of the things that I teach my students is actually to recognize their cognitive biases, right? And the way to do that is to really shift into rational thinking or to statistical thinking, and little things like classic examples of game theory, like you already spent this much money in a movie and you hated it. Should you leave the movie house? And people say, no, I already spent money for it. Well, whether or not you leave and you're not enjoying it, you've already put in the money. So, it's like, so it's fine to leave. Little things like those that in your
cost fallacy, particularly for business. I mean, that's relationships. That's a critical one for people to get. Sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, sunk cost fallacy, confirmation bias, especially in social media and so on. It's like I make them very aware. Not only in business and so on, but in their daily lives. How they do this. And one of the things that I introduced in a more advanced phase is the work of Carl Friston. You're familiar with him?
I'm not.
Carl Friston is basically he's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. He's one of the most influential neuroscientists of time, and he's a computational neuroscientist. He's in the short list for Nobel. And the first time I read his stuff, I could not fucking know what was going on, and it took me a while because there were postings. There were postings as a Starling Codex, etc. So it's like, God help us. How do we understand his work? But I finally got to understand it's actually very simple. And his work is actually being followed closely by the machine learning artificial intelligence community, and that's why I mentioned him. And because also it borders on what consciousness is, his work. So essentially, he has what's called each system. Each organism or system that minimizes free energy, right? That minimizes free energy. You can see it basically alter its behavior and its environment. So it's part of there's a concept called free energy that every organism minimizes, and he applies it to the brain. So essentially, you have an input, and then the input actually just checks for minimizes free energy, meaning it checks whether or not its model of the environment of what is outside is basically matches with the model that is created inside the brain, right? And then it acts to minimize the error, right? So it acts to minimize that error. And you could basically make that abstract and put that into any system. And so you say, he essentially what's the difference between a drop of ink, right? A drop of ink in water. A drop of ink in water has a boundary, right? But it's not sensing its external environment, right? And it doesn't have anything to change the environment with. Whereas an organism, a unicellular organism, for example, would be able to move itself away from, say, a temperature gradient, right? Because its model of the world is that's going to be harmful for him. So survival first, right? It's going to be harmful for him. But survival isn't programmed into it. It's just checking whether or not the external model of the world, the model that is created for its internal world matches the external, and by how much error. So minimizing free energy means minimizing that error of the model of the world. So now they've created machine learning systems that are not trained on anything, but just minimizing the free energy, and they're getting fantastic results. So it's something that I am evaluating, because one of the things that he said in an interview, so how do you define life then, right? Is having the capacity to change the state of the external world. Meaning, if you have a flagellum as a unicellular organism, you could swim away, or you could change, right, where you are. And he calls this thing epistemic foraging. I love the phrase. It's a great phrase. Yeah.
Trying to think of a counterexample. I mean, certainly even chemicals and radioactive compounds very dramatically change the world. I mean, they can't move themselves, but there's many non-living things that can.
Yeah, but they don't create a model of the world from within them. Right? These ones, they actively have a model of the world.
So they create a model of the world, and then act with independent.
And then it will act to minimize its error of its prediction of the world, right?
Okay. So this also could be then applied to artificial intelligence. Right?
Yeah, because it's artificial. So basically, it's minimizing its error in predicting. That's the summary of it. So it minimizes its error of prediction of its model of the world.
And you think this applies all the way down to like single-celled organisms?
That's where he was brought to in the interview, right? And she said, so it was very interesting. So what is life then? And it's like, well, it boils down to the simple capacity to move actively to change the state, right? To minimize your error of prediction. So that's it sort of really boils down everything to, statistical mechanics, really. And it's a very interesting notion. Of course, it has its critics, but I'm watching it very closely.
It's interesting that he went for that instead of, if I was to think about that, it's interesting that he went for that instead of replication. Like, you could look at life as self-replicating systems, because in my mind, the most fundamental building block of life is that it replicates itself in some way. I think it applies across the board.
Jason, I'm more of a survival guy rather than a replication guy, because replication is a mode of survival.
Okay.
Right? So it's a mode of replication is a mode of surviving. So look at us. We have kids because we know that we're not going to live forever. So essentially, this is for sexual reproduction, right? And for me, being able to replicate. This is just me, right? Because I take a look at it. First, you have to survive, right? Mm-hmm. And then, as a mode of surviving, you reproduce, right? Whether or not it's your genes. That's why, Dawkins said it's the selfish genes. We're just carriers for the genes anyway. If you go and assume the perspective of the gene, it's like, this sac is gonna be gone, but I'm gonna make sure that he fucks his way to death until so this is and for me, that's the way I look at it. So reproduction becomes secondary to it, because it's basically a mode of surviving. That's just my point of view.
Okay, so then we could, just theoretically, we could have some type of immortal organism, like a tardigrade or something like that, which is, will be immortal but not reproduce theoretically.
Yeah. For me, for example, if you take a look at the experiments that's going on, they're trying to create, to trying to evolve life, right? How did life evolve? And there is a lab that actually tries to do this by taking a look at, ammonia and all of those, and trying to see whether or not life will come out of that. But what I imagine happening is that, say you get a first blob that's able to do this, it's probably not going to replicate right away, right? It's going to be surviving, etc., and then it will disintegrate, and then another blob in the same conditions, right, manages to, say, sequester some within itself some of the molecules required for RNA, right? Because the predominant view is that it was an RNA world before it became a DNA world, right? So you could see that
all the RNA then.
Yeah. So that and then so on. So basically it becomes a competition among these species, and then there came the capacity to reproduce themselves. Because for me, evolution is not of the fittest, but of the most stable, right? So what is the most stable system out there?
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's like cockroaches will inherit the earth. It's like it's totally true. And I think that obviously that experiment is no, I think you're right. I don't need to say more about it than that. I think that's a more correct statement.
But you see, from consciousness, we could see now how we have begun to discuss all this, right? If you see this consciousness an inherent property of the universe, and then from there you begin to construct all of these things that are able to minimize their free energy, by checking their models' predictive success, of the world, and then, well, are they alive? Right, from an ink blot to an ink blob to an organism, and then it's alive. But where do you place consciousness then? Right? Is it inherent? Is it below, preceding everything else, or is it, as we're looking at it now, as an emergent property of systems?
I think all roads lead to panpsychism, which nobody. That's just me. I would say that, wouldn't I? I can say that. I can get away with that because I'm not a scientist. But I do think that is the case. personally. And on that note, I want to, because this is this podcast, I got to ask you about your experience with Dzogchen and Bon, and how you got interested in that, and what that process was like. Did you go study with people? Did you did you do this earlier in life, or did it become an interest later on? How did your own mystic journey, if you will, happen, particularly, and what was that like from a scientific background?
Well, it was actually quite interesting because I was just buying some jam from a monastery, and it's gone now. It's no longer there, and there was a monk that was seated on the steps, and basically I came up to him to say hello. Bringing some jam in, and he started talking to me. He asked me what I was doing. I said I'm doing I'm a doctor poking brains, but I'm doing my research on artificial intelligence, specifically interested in consciousness. And she said, consciousness. Oh, turns out he's an aerospace engineer from Stanford. So, and who is actually the head of that. And he said, I said, if you're willing, he basically offered, he said, if you want, I could teach you, how we look at, because I don't read any of the books, I can't read them. And he said, I can sit with you and read them with you. So essentially I was there most weekends while being in the lab. It was a little difficult in the beginning because I kept on translating, right? I kept on translating
from Tibetan.
No, I kept on translating what he was saying in terms of the Eastern philosophy, right, into the lab where I was working on the nervous system on this worm, right? And I was, you're studying this and you're publishing a paper on our worms, our C. elegans worms, left or right-handed, or chiral, they call it chirality. They have no hands. But you begin to see what he's saying because I'm studying this tiny little organism, and you take a look at and examine your own, right? And the thing that was most interesting is that I've been meditating since high school, right? So I've tried various modes of meditation all the way to college, etc. Mm-hmm. But it was more of a concentrative type of meditation, right? I am known for my powers of concentration where, you had a loud bang behind me and you couldn't distract me from what I was doing. That's how bad I was. So, someone yells fire and someone has to yank me out of the library, that kind of thing. But the more I realized the whole process is that I had this peak experiences in meditation where I was just observing all of these thoughts coming up, and this came out naturally, right? So when he essentially said, "Well, they're coming from the Bon tradition," and so on. So I basically began to study with them and the group. So on. And it was quite interesting for me because, this is a most interesting statement that I remember from that. He said, Bon, before Buddhism, he said, there was no classification, right? And he said, Buddhism is like a predator. It's a big religion. It will eat up all of the smaller religions.
Oh, yeah, they're real Bon people then.
It will eat up all of these smaller groups like Bon, right? It will eat up these smaller groups like Bon. But we've managed to, he said, the one thing that came out of that they were able to classify Bon practices, right? They were able to, 9 ways of Bon, etc. Was post-Buddhist. They were able to classify, what you would call in Western magic as evocation, invocation,
Sure. My understanding of Bon, I don't know, I haven't done Bon, but I've done the comparable shamanism from the other side of the Himalayas in India, or in Nepal, excuse me. But my understanding of Bon is that it's essentially shamanism and magic, right? And there are divination and evocation and all.
And they call it soul work. where you see these practices that were popularized before, where you retrieve bits and pieces of your soul for someone else that you gave out, and so on and so forth. But the way he was explaining it to me is that these are bits and pieces of energy that have to come back to you, or something like that. So it was interesting in the sense that the first four ways of Bon are all about magic, right? So it's if you look at the classification, it's all about magic, and then the fifth and the sixth way is how you live your life, more like the more like Buddhism.
Right life. You do that at the end instead of the beginning, which is how Buddhism and yoga do that at the beginning.
Yeah,
at the end. Okay.
Yeah, the Bon starts with magic first, because it's more, and the magic's a lot more of energy systems more than anything, right? Because they consider those dimensions, the realms, as really part of this dimension, just part of an expanded consciousness. The way I view it now is really like the way Douglas Harding in The Headless Way, right, puts it. It's like right now you're looking at me as a person. But if you move far away from me and above me, you'll see me as a city. And you move far away from me, you see me as the earth, and so on. If you move close,
that's great. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if you move farther from me, you'll see me as a galaxy. So who are you really, right? And if you move close to me, you'll see me as cells, and you move closer, and get closer, and then finally, what do you find, right? It's a question mark. You don't know what it is that you'll find in there. So that's the way I actually now conceptualize what he was trying to teach, right? So whatever you're it depends on where you're actually looking or where you're meeting something at.
No, I think it's interesting. I mean, just my view of magic also is largely, I don't know. I'm actually very reductionist about magic these days. I think it's actually more interesting to think about it in terms of neurotransmitters, what's happening in the brain, what does meditation do, and it's obviously, it gets me into less cultural hot water to teach it that way. I think it makes it more palatable to people. But I also think that my experience doing so much wackadoodle magic stuff is like, I mean, we're interacting with, when you imagine like some type of insect in your carpet trying to interact with you. Or, it's like we're interacting with these massive interlocking systems that we're not able to perceive because our apparatus for perceiving them is so limited. But it's like, that doesn't mean that they're not there, and we might not be able to somehow find a way to signal to them, right? Because if they're also intelligent, and I'm not even being religious at this point. I'm just saying, like, there are much larger and much smaller systems than us, and fields of consciousness, and we don't need to call those gods or spirits. They're just this vast architecture that we're in that we don't understand. But that doesn't mean that they're not intelligent, and there may not be a way to interact with them.
Yeah, I just call them essentially energy currents, right? It's like a vast river with vast oceans with many currents in them, and it depends on where you want to flow. So which current you want to flow with, and essentially, if you take a look at you just have to get to the right vibe or perspective to be
that's
able
critical in magic. I mean, we talk about the magical current or the 93 current or the 20 different magical currents, chaos current, and it's the same as the idea of the stream in Buddhism. Like you get it, and all that just happens. It's very mysterious.
Yeah, but so those are the first four, and then the rest would be live, like 5 and 6 would be living your how to live your life, and then 8 are the secret doctrines and of the secret teachings, which are practices that they have, and then 9 is Dzogchen.
Okay.
So.
What are the secret ones generally about? I mean, I understand maybe they're secret, but usually,
it's basically
usually those are sexual if they're secret. But
it's essentially, the classic definition, right? It's basically, Sutra, Tantra, and Dzogchen. Right, so the secret teachings revolve around the various sutras, right, and essentially they say that the shorthand of it is the sutra basically seeks to deny or reject, right, a poison. Right, it will. If it's considered a poison, then you reject the poison. Whereas the tantra says, well, okay, you embrace it as like a pill, right, or that this part like a medicine for you. And Dzogchen,
I do that every day.
yeah, and Dzogchen is actually swallowing the poison and using it to liberate you. Right, so using it to liberate you, following,
There's so much perspective on things.
So using it to liberate you. So essentially, it's a preparation for Dzogchen to swallow the entire poison for liberation. Right.
No, that actually tends to be my pretty much fundamental approach. It's not articulated through Dzogchen, but I mean that's very much in Hindu Tantra as well. They have the story that Shiva swallows the entire ocean of poison and turns it blue in his throat.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. The much of the tantras, of course, you learn, and then as a way of life, etc. And then heavy teaching on Vajrayana Tantra, and that particular part, and what's essential to Bon, right? Essential to the Bon practice, etc. That has been obfuscated, either obfuscated or made palatable, right? Made palatable.
But what is that was obfuscated? I'm curious.
Like, for example, the original symbolisms in for example, just the word Vajra, right? It means they call it the thunderbolt, but it actually means a dick. So things like those
thunderbolt.
You make it flash as a thunderbolt, and you have a kid. So, but anyway. Things like those, like here you are, for example, you're reading a translation. Much of it was actually a lot of teaching, and here's what the Western translation is, and here's what the actual, how it actually looks like.
That's the same in Western magic. I mean, usually if there's that's why I said usually if there's something secret or obfuscated, almost always it's a dick joke. No, it's always sexual symbolism. That tends to be the way to understand things. But you need to still interpret it correctly because there's a correct semiotics to things. But that tends to be what's going on.
Yeah. Well, so it's essentially like the path of rejection, and then the path of transformation, and then the path of liberation. So essentially, it's how it's taught.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I should probably put a pin in it because I'm dying of thirst and need to take a business call. We've been talking for 2 hours, though.
Oh my God, have we?
We have. I'm sure we could talk for a long time, and there's all kinds of subjects we could touch upon. It's been so we should just, as Sam Harris says, we should just put a pin in it for now.
I love his precision of language.
Yeah. Is there anything? Although, if you ever really want to, if you need to like hate your life, listen to the debate he did with either Ezra Klein or Jordan Peterson. It's just like, oh my God. But is there anything you want to promote or tell people, or how can people find out more about you?
Yes, actually, with a nonprofit that I have, if you want to practice health optimization medicine, or if you're a non-doctor, there's health optimization practice or HOPE. You can go to homehope.org. We offer the entire. This is my nonprofit, so it's running on my money. So come and learn how to basically balance your metabolites so you can be healthy, and it's sort of like as a maintenance for your body. And if you want to do that as a professional, there's an entire course in there that's available for you. And if not, you can just take modules, the various different modules in there that are available too. I also started a company, Smarter Not Harder Inc. I joke that we're not a condom company.
We're
not a condom company. And our brand of products there is called Prescriptions. So that's like prescription, but with a TRO. And there are nootropics that I created specifically for myself. One is called Blue Carnitine, and it's doing quite well. I call it, the NZT, the Limitless, but it's good for 3 to 4 hours. It is very gentle rise and come down.
What's in it?
It is a methylene blue, caffeine, nicotine,
I've tried
and CBD.
Okay, well, those are all good. I've tried methylene blue. The jury's out. It's interesting.
Yeah, a methylene blue doesn't have a kick in itself, but methylene blue is an MAOI, right?
Okay.
The other one is just pure methylene blue on request of people, right? Who just want some methylene blue, so it's called Just Blue. And we have several products actually coming out this year. I formulated all of them. That will be one will be a troche. This is a troche format, meaning it's like a lozenge, but these are buccal troches, meaning you have to shove it between your gum and your upper cheek, right? Okay. And one will be, the one that's coming out will be for anxiety, right? And it will contain some kava in it. And then we have some. We have something coming out for pain and also for insomnia. And those will be rolled out this year. We're ready to go in probably a couple of months with anxiety troche.
Awesome.
So, yeah. And that's how, by the way, guys, that's how I fund the nonprofit. So this is all, one hand giving back to the other and very giving to the other. So,
well, I will definitely go check that stuff out, and sounds great. Well, I'm sure we will talk again, not too long from now.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, with that $1 million voice. Very soon.
Thank you. That was a great conversation, and thank you again, and let's talk again soon.
All right, Jason.
All right. Okay, hope you really, really enjoyed that interview. I definitely did. Make sure to check us out at magic.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. And come see us in the next office hours. They're every 2 weeks, so we got one coming up right away. And really looking forward to seeing you there. And it's always an amazing time. All right, until next time, I will see you in class.